All right. So listen up, guys. The people of Israel, the Old Testament people, the ancient Jewish people, the people we always talk about in the Bible, they understood themselves and they defined themselves by the fact that they were God's chosen people. Like if you were to say, okay, what is it that makes a Jewish person a Jewish person? For centuries, thousands of years ago, for centuries, they would have said, well, we are God's chosen people. And if you would have asked them, okay, well, in what way are you God's chosen people? How do you know that you are God's chosen people? How does being God's chosen people impact your day-to-day life? They would not have given you some vague, nebulous answer about, stories or, visions or anything else. They would have said, well, God has made us promises, and we have them. So the first promise was the promise of land. All the way back to the very first person that we could consider even remotely Jewish, a guy by the name of Abraham, God promised land, a home, a place to go to. And throughout the earliest stories of the Bible, we see God making those promises. We see that's where they're going after the Exodus. That's where everything is leading up, to the land of milk and honey with the capital of Jerusalem. And if you asked an ancient Jewish person, who are you? They would say, we are God's chosen people. And if you said, why? They'd say, well, look where we live. We're in the promised land. And you said, well, is there anything else? They'd say, well, of course. We have a king. God has promised us a king, but not just any king, a king as part of a regular, completely, absolute, always one lineage of kings. It was always going to be a king in the family of David. So forever, for centuries, they have a king in the line of David. And because God promised that there would always be a king in the line of David, he said a king of an everlasting kingdom. They would say, okay, we are God's people. And if you said, okay, great, you live in the land and you have your king, is there anything else? They'd say, well, of course, we have the temple. The temple that God said he would make sure was built, by one of those kings, and that temple would be where God would always be. If you ever wondered where God was, the answer is the temple. God is always with us because we can find him in the temple. For centuries, if you asked an ancient Jewish person, who are you? When you look in the mirror, what do you see? When you think about who you are on an existential level, what do you think about? They would have said, we are God's chosen. And if you said, why? They would have said, we have the land, we have a king, we have a temple. Ancient Jewish people defined their entire nationalistic, religious, communal identity, even as individuals, based on those three promises of God that were fulfilled. And I tell you that because one day they lost all three in one fell swoop. One day, a king of a nation called Babylon, the king was named Nebuchadnezzar, invaded, and he conquered, and he destroyed. And the Jewish king was named Jehoiakim, and he died in the battle. And the land was taken from them as they were taken away as slaves. And on their way out, they could see the temple brick by brick being razed and destroyed. In essentially an afternoon, the people of Israel, God's chosen people, lost every piece of their identity. Everything that made them special, everything that made them, everything that defined their relationship with God, everything that when they looked in the mirror, they could say, okay, I am God's chosen people, this is who I am. They lost all of it in the blink of an eye with one battle, one war. And that hurt. To say the least. I mean, you can imagine if you lost everything that made you you all in an afternoon, you can imagine how you might be feeling. This is what we read. There's a prophet by the name of Jeremiah who writes a book called Lamentations. Real short, little depressing book in the Old Testament. And this is what we read him talking about. This is what he says was going on this is how the people felt. It said, Jerusalem, once so full of people, is now deserted. She who was once great among the nations now sits alone like a widow. Once the queen of all the earth, she's now a slave. She sobs through the night, tears stream down her cheeks, and among all her lovers there is no one left to comfort her. All of her friends betrayed her and become her enemies. Judah has been led away into captivity, oppressed with cruel slavery. She lives among foreign nations and has no place of rest. Her enemies have chased her down. She has nowhere to turn. Jeremiah is describing a people who once, you say they have nowhere to turn. These are people who defined who they were solely through their relationship to God. But now, everything that they could point to as evidence of their relationship to God was gone. The people of Israel, as this happened, begin to wonder, well, does God not love us anymore? Does God not care about us anymore? Has God just left us? Was God even real in the first place? Are the other gods of the other nations actually the right ones? They start asking these tough questions. For 50 years, the people of Israel live as slaves in exile far away from home. And for 50 years, they wrestle with what it even means to be them at this point. What does it mean to be God's chosen people when God's chosen blessing is gone? What does it mean to be God's people when God has left you? They started looking at themselves and they said, okay, where is it that we sinned? What did we do? They started looking at their faith. Okay, maybe we didn't worship right. Maybe, what did we do wrong? And for 50 years, collectively as a nation, as a people, they tried to figure out what went wrong. And then one day there was another battle that had nothing to do with them. The Persians invaded the Babylonians. The Persians won. And the king of the Persians looked at these Israelite slaves and said, well, I don't want you guys. They're like, well, what do we do? Like, go home. I'm not here to conquer you guys. That's nothing. Go home. Get out of here. And by way of apathy of a new king, the people of Israel are set free. And they go back home. But as you might imagine, life was different at that point. Because for centuries, they had banked on this idea that they were God's chosen people because they had a king, and they had a land, and they had a temple. And it's weird how that king of an everlasting kingdom doesn't seem so everlasting when it can be broken up for 50 years. And when the temple of God's presence can be destroyed brick by brick and razed to the ground, that seems like a weird place for God to be. And yeah, the land is great, but somebody can come in and take it at any point. What does it matter? And the people realized they needed something else to define themselves by. They needed something else to hang their hats on, something else that would help them when they look in the mirror to say, okay, this is who I am. Existentially, their entire identity was gone and they needed a new one. And so they decided to do something they had never done before. Not really. 2,600 years ago, they decided to write the Old Testament. They didn't call it the Old Testament, of course, it's what we call it. But coming home from the exile, coming home from slavery, they said, we need something else. The temple can be destroyed, the land can be taken, a king can be killed, but our stories, our history, our poetry, our prophets, no one can take those. So let's make sure we always have them. So for a lot of it, they started just sitting down and writing. Okay, what are our traditions, our oral traditions, the things we've always said? Let's put them together, let's edit them, let's put them in a format we can actually deal with. And they said, okay, that's great. And then they took some writings from David and some writings of poetry and some writings of the prophets from centuries before. They said, okay, this is really good stuff. And they added that to it and they put it all together. And at the end, they have scriptures for the very first time. Scriptures they would consider holy. scriptures they could always remember. Because see, that's the thing about a story. That's the thing about a tradition. That's the thing about a poem. You can kill a king, you can take a land, you can destroy a building. But if you've got a story and it's part of you, nobody can take that. And so from that moment forward, the people of Israel sort of stopped being defined through their relationship to God with the king and the temple and the land. And from that moment forward, they began to become defined by their relationship to God through their scriptures. And we tell a lot of those stories in children's church as Christians. But there's one in particular that for the people of Israel may have actually been the most important, more than any other. Over the last couple of months, we've talked about some stories that are incredibly familiar to us, like David and Goliath and Jonah and Noah and Adam and Eve. We talked about all these stories, and we think, okay, those are the really important ones. But there's a story that to an ancient Israelite person, particularly coming out of the exile, particularly questioning where they stand with God, particularly questioning where they stand in the world, a story that is, man, so fundamental to who they were. And in fact, should be fundamental to who we are. But I got to tell you, it's a weird one. And it's a story about a gentleman by the name of Jacob. So Jacob is one of the big three, the patriarchs of the Old Testament. When they would talk about who their God is, right? They would say he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob is our third. Jacob, his father is Isaac, his grandfather is Abraham in the story. And Jacob's story begins right out of the womb. There's this weird thing where he's a twin, and he's the younger one of the two. There is Esau, is his older brother by just minutes or even just maybe moments. And the story goes that he's holding on to the heel of his brother as they come out. And that is a sign and a symbol of the struggle that will be throughout their entire lives of both these two brothers and the people that they would produce, the nations that they would produce. So right from the start, we have a conflict between these brothers, between Jacob and Esau. And I got to tell you, it's like 99% all Jacob's fault. Jacob, he's just got this thing where he doesn't tell the truth, and he's pretty manipulative, and he has no interest in doing anything the right way, but he really wants what he wants. So our first episode in Jacob's life goes like this. Esau is out in the fields and he's hunting. It's what Esau does. He brings things to the family. He contributes to the family. Jacob contributes nothing. He just kind of hangs out at home. And Esau is out hunting, and he comes home, and he says, man, I am starving. And we all say that, we are starving when we're hungry. We all say that. But Esau essentially meant it. He meant, I am literally starving. And so Jacob takes this opportunity where he says, okay, look, I will give you food. I'm at home. I've got all the food in my possession here. I will give you food, but only if you trade this food for your birthright. Now, we should understand culturally things are different. Basically, the older son is the heir of the family and everyone else is behind. Esau, as the oldest, he's the heir of everything. He should be the most important one in the family. And Jacob, through absolutely nothing he's ever done to earn anything, says, Esau, I think I should be the most important one. And he says, I will give you this food and save your life only if you make me the most important one in the family. Esau doesn't want to do this, but the man is very hungry, and so he says, okay, I'll do what I need to do, we'll work it out later. So right from the start, we see Jacob being a little weasel. He's a little weasel. It's interesting, though, his father, Isaac, it's strangely, you guys who are parents, he looks at the situation, he says, I'll tell you what, that is not legally binding. I will not accept that as a legally binding contract. Okay? We're just not going to deal with that, so forget it. The whole episode is stupid. We'll just move on. And so Jacob, they go on, they go through their life, and Jacob is, Isaac, I'm going to do that like 8 times. They're very difficult names. The dad, Isaac, Isaac's getting up there in age, and he's getting old. And he goes to Esau, and he says, hey, man, I want to give you your blessing as my firstborn son. I want to give you the birthright. I want to make sure, legally speaking, spiritually speaking, you are the head of this family, and you are the most important one. So what I want you to do is go and kill an animal. It's so delicious when you kill these animals. So go kill an animal, bring it back, we'll cook it up, we'll eat, it'll be a wonderful meal, and I'll give you your birthright. And Esau's like, yeah, that's great, let's go do that. Jacob, of course, is at home because Jacob doesn't do anything. Jacob contributes nothing to the family. But Jacob's mom, her name is Rebecca, she just loves Jacob for really reasons that are hard to understand. And so she goes to Jacob and she says, listen, all right, so the first stealing the birthright didn't work, but I'll tell you what, we can get him this time. See, because your dad can't see anymore because he's very old. So what we're going to do is we're going to dress you up like Esau. Esau's a very hairy individual. We're going to put some goat skin on you, on your neck and on your arms. He's extremely hairy. We're going to dress you up like a goat, okay? You're going to change your voice. Oh, I'm Esau. And you're going to go give him some food, and he's going to give you the blessing, and that will be legally binding. So Jacob, not questioning this plan at all, dresses up like a goat in order to swindle his disabled, dying father out of the blessing that he has done nothing to earn. And that's exactly what he does. And Esau comes home, and Isaac is all, he can't see. He's like, hey, well, I already gave you all your stuff. And Esau's like, that wasn't me. That was my kid brother. And it's just, the whole thing's a mess. But because of that, Jacob ends up being the most important one of the family. And Esau does the only reasonable thing at this point. He says, well, I'm going to literally kill him because I'm a hunter and I hunt things, and he just sits at home and does nothing. So this should be an easy kill. And so Jacob gets his blessing, but he ends up having to escape. He ends up having to leave home and go somewhere else because his brother is going to literally murder him. And that is when, depending on your point of view, a very funny thing happens, and also maybe not so funny. I'll let you decide. So Jacob ends up in this place, this land called Haran. And in Haran, he meets a family. The father is named Laban, and then there are two sisters named Rachel and Leah. Okay? So Jacob meets this family, and he meets Rachel, and he is smitten. She is gorgeous. She is everything anybody would ever want. So he works out an arrangement with the father, Laban, that, hey, I will work for 7 years. I have no dowry. This is the way ancient cultures work. He's like, I have no dowry, but I will work for you for 7 years, and then you will give me Rachel to marry. And everybody agrees to it, and for 7 years, Jacob ends up, working. So then they have a wedding. And on the wedding night, Jacob goes to his marriage bed to seal the deal. And when he wakes up the next morning, he's very alarmed. Because, in fact, it is not Rachel. It is Leah. And the Bible goes to great lengths to explain that Leah is not an attractive woman. I'm not trying to be mean, but she's not a pretty lady. And he does not want Leah. No, he does not. He wants Rachel. And so Jacob goes to Laban, and he's like, hey, what did you do? And it's at that point when Laban shows the most self-control that I've ever heard in the Bible, because Laban does not say, oh, you don't like being swindled, huh? Being lied to and deceived, it hurts, huh? Hurts people. He doesn't say that. He doesn't. Should have, though. Should have. The irony, by the way, is we're wondering, one of the great theories of theology in the Bible is that actually Jacob, so Isaac couldn't see, right? Well, Jacob probably couldn't see all that well either. So, he gets, exactly what he did to his father. He gets done to him. Anyway, so 7 more years, and he ends up with Rachel because Laban does not mess around. I need 7 more years of work out of you. And he gets Rachel. That's a weird story. All of that is weird, and there's more to it, guys, but it's very odd. Like, this whole story is weird, and you think, okay, what is going on with Jacob? Why is Jacob even in the Bible? Like, why is this, like, surely the Jews have better stories than this. Surely, like, better things happened. And it's interesting, my whole life I've heard these stories. All the way going back to being like 5 or 6 years old in children's church, we hear these stories of different things. I remember Harry Esau. That was always funny. You remember these stories, and I remember growing up. There's always an attempt made to make Jacob into not a terrible person. There's always this attempt made. There's always an attempt to where it's like, okay, well, Esau, we victim blame Esau. Like, well, he shouldn't have been so hungry. Like, he shouldn't have been out hunting. Should have stayed home with his father instead of doing with his... Like, this is weird, like, blaming Esau for existing thing that goes on. And then sometimes we talk, like, I don't know, somebody somewhere has absolutely preached a Mother's Day sermon about how Rebecca just loves Jacob so much that she's willing to swindle, Isaac that way. Like, it's like this weird, like, what a mother's love. And then, speaking of love, like, I've also heard, like, Rachel and Jacob as this, beautiful love story from people who clearly never read the story, because that's not beautiful, nor is it loving. It's a very odd thing, because we're trying to, like, I don't know why we're doing it. We're trying to sanitize the story. We try to moralize the story. But I think it's actually really important that we do neither of those things, and we just say this. Jacob is terrible. He's a bad guy. He is morally bankrupt. He's not a person we should want to be like. He's a liar. He's a cheater. He's a swindler. He is selfish. He takes advantage of the elderly. Like, there's nothing good in Jacob. And that's what makes the next two passages really rather amazing. You see, there's nothing good in Jacob. There's not. And when we see there's nothing good in Jacob, then we can see the beauty in what we read in Genesis chapter 28. While Jacob was on his journeys, we read this. It says, Jacob dreamed of a stairway that reached from the earth up to heaven. And he saw the angels of God going up and down the stairway. At the top of the stairway stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham, and the God of your father Isaac. The ground you are lying on belongs to you. I am giving it to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. They will spread out in all directions, to the east and the west, to the north and the south. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. What's more, I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go. One day I will bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I have finished giving you everything I have promised you. Jacob was a terrible person. And God says, I love you. I am blessing you. I am with you. I am protecting you. You see, during the exile, during those 50 years, the people of Israel came to a startling conclusion. It was their fault. They came to the conclusion that they had sinned, that they had rejected God, that they had lived in such a way that they had not so politely asked God to stay out of their lives, and so God sort of politely did. And the result of God staying out of their lives was the Babylonians invading. The people of Israel, as they had some self-reflection, as they looked at who they were, as they looked at what their lives were, as they understood who God was, they said, we deserve for God to abandon us. And yet God did not. Just like Jacob. Jacob deserved for God to abandon him. And yet God did not. But that's just half the puzzle. It's half the puzzle. The craziest chapter or passage in the entire Bible I will ever read is following. And here it is, also in Genesis. Again, in Jacob's travels. It says, this left Jacob all alone in the camp. He's all alone in the camp. And a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. And he replied, "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob," the man told him. "From now on, you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won." Okay, that's very odd. Very strange. Let's just set aside all the oddities for a minute and see this as a story and an allegory. Jacob, we've already established a bad guy, but a guy that God is not abandoning. Jacob spends all night wrestling with, fighting, striving, fighting with God. And he loses. And he's wounded. But he doesn't give up. And because he doesn't give up the fight at all. His name is changed from Jacob to Israel. And God tells him, "You've won." Which is to say this: what it means to be a person of God is to be a person who wrestles with God and doesn't give up. Yeah, we argue. Yeah, we question. Yeah, we doubt. Yeah, we struggle. Yeah, things don't make sense, and we say, that doesn't make any sense. But when we don't give up, we win. That's what it means to be Israel. The name Israel comes from a story of a terrible person wrestling with God and not giving up. What it means to be God's person, or what it means to be the people of God, this is it. This story, when you ask a person in ancient Israel, what does it mean to be Israel? They'd say, we wrestle with God. We argue, we fight, we complain, but then we repent, and we change our minds, and we change our hearts, and we submit, and we follow. And yeah, we walk around with a limp because it hurts to do this. But it's honest. It's honest. It's a relationship with God that has integrity. It's a relationship with God that's real, because it's real people with a real God. 2,600 years ago, the people of Israel said, you know what? We've lost everything, but let's write some scriptures. And when they got around to writing their origin story, if you would, like one of those comic movies, the origin story of Israel, the climax was an Indian leg wrestling match. I always picture it that way because that's what we did in third grade, PE, between Jacob and God. And Jacob was changed, so we are Israel now. As Christians, no, we're not Jewish. But as we read in the New Testament, we are the Israel of God. In the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, Paul makes it clear that we are God's people. Peter makes it very clear, attaching language from the Old Testament directly onto the church, that we are a royal priesthood and all of those things. Which means for us as Christians, at the end of the day, we're going to doubt. We're going to question. We're going to struggle. And so many Christians suppress that. So many Christians don't want to admit that. So many Christians think that they're doing the wrong thing if they question and doubt and all of that. But this is built into the DNA of God's people. From the very beginning, we fight with God. We wrestle with God. And we change. And we repent. And we see things differently now than we used to. People of Israel, they didn't stop understanding a king and a land and a temple. They rebuilt the temple. They had kings. They were in the land. But they saw it differently. Their relationship with God evolved, and it changed, and it was molded around their experiences. And they were able to do that most of all because at the end of the day, their trust was not in a God who would abandon them. Not in a God where you have to be good enough to meet him, but the God of Jacob, the lying, snivelly little weasel. And that brings us to our ninth and final lesson from Children's Church. Our ninth lesson, as we finish this series after over 2 months, we learn a valuable lesson. We should always wrestle with our faith in God, knowing he will always faithfully love us. We should always wrestle with our faith in God, knowing he will always faithfully love us. So when the musicians are going to come forward, we're going to sing one of those songs we just sang a minute ago. We offer an invitation each and every week to take God up on his offer of his unconditional love and grace and presence in our lives. The Bible teaches that when we believe in who he is, that we are called to repent and be baptized. That sounds like two things. I promise you it's just one. In repentance, we say, I want things God's way. I change my mind. I want things the way that God wants them. And in baptism, it's a picture of that. We go down in the water. It's like our old selves being put to death. We get out of the water. It's our new selves being born again. We align ourselves with Christ now and forever. If you've never made the decision, we get a nice warm baptistry. All sorts of people can do it. Let's talk. If you're already a immersed believer, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. But we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up while we do it. And we want to wrestle with God. In our doubts and our questions and our struggles, we don't want to give up, knowing that God does not give up on us. As we stand,